I realized, especially in the study area in Indonesia, that sustainable land use transformations can only happen together with the local communities and the decision makers, and agroecology for me is like the perfect field to pursue these goals, because you are working in between land use science and conservation in my case, and it's a perfect field to combine the two. So in this study already, I studied bird communities in Indonesia, and I focused on the study of ecosystem services, mainly also in the years after. So ecosystem services, we have a largely academic society, but they are defined as by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. As you see in this graph, there are 4 different types: identify the provisioning services, regulating services, supporting and cultural services. You also see a couple of examples here, such as food, raw materials, and also pollination or predation services or photosynthesis, clear water, and basically all the resources that also are inside the laptop you're currently looking at. They all belong to ecosystem services, so they're closely linked to our human well-being. We heavily depend on these services and properly functioning ecosystems worldwide, but they're also under acute and increasing threat. So also according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, already 60% of the ecosystem services worldwide are in decline or degraded. And there is urgent action, urgent need to act against these threats in order to sustain functioning ecosystems, but also human well-being. And my research was focused on regulating services such as biological pollination and predation services in agriculture. And here I focused on the study of birds, bats, and arthropods, so not only bugs, but it sounds really nice, birds, bats, and bugs. We worked with different arthropods actually. And why we work with birds and bats. So birds and bats are perfect model organisms. They're both, due to their ability to fly, they're highly mobile. They exist with high number of species, with a high number of functional diversity. So we have seed eaters, insect eaters, pollinating, predating species all over the global biomes. And due to their high mobility, they connect resources within and between different habitat types. And they're also very good indicator species. So they usually respond quite directly to land use change and landscape changes. And so we can derive a lot of valuable and highly important ecological data from birds and bats. And so most birds are day active and most bats are night active. So with this group, we really cover 24-hour of ecosystem service provision in different ecosystems. And this is highly interesting. So they're key drivers of plant-animal interactions, nutrient transport, and for the ecosystem resilience. And ultimately, because they contribute to so many ecosystem services across different types, you see this in this short graphic below. So this is a bit of a teaser because this graphic below is part of a invited view paper. So actually a perspective paper on cross-disciplinary concepts for better research and looking at the case of birds and bats. And this is coming up in the Journal of Basic and Applied Ecology, hopefully soon. So when the editors hear me now, no, just kidding. So we were asking ourselves, how important are these services for sustainable agricultural development? And in particular, we were looking at these regulating services. So with the next few slides, I give you a broad and quick overview of the research history that we have done and how this develops, and the really only the key results. We are touching on different topics here, but I I want to support this overall message of diversity at all levels. So yeah, this is a bit of a chronological order. And it all started with the picture that you saw in the beginning and during my diploma research, where I was fortunate enough to, that I was handed over data from 2001. So 2001, I wasn't even finished with school, not far. But 2001, Matthias Waltert and his colleagues from University of Göttingen did the first bird community study in central Sulawesi in Indonesia, a study area that should become my home and working place and my research area for the next 7 years after I started my diploma research. But 2001, they did a habitat gradient study where they looked at old primary forests, as you see in this picture, young secondary forests. By the way, do you see my cursor in the slides? Oh, that's great. So I can use it as a pointer a bit. Yeah, they looked at agroforestry systems in these areas. It's mainly cacao. 80% of the agroforestry systems in central Sulawesi, at least in the time when I worked there, are cacao agroforestry systems and annual culture. And then for my diploma, I took the same data set, so the same locations of the 16 different habitat types, and I looked at the changes of the bird community across these 6 years of land use change. So some of the primary forests had been cut down and slashed and burned, as you have seen in the picture in the beginning. Some of the secondary forests have been turned into cacao agroforestry systems. The cacao agroforestry systems themselves, they are highlighted here because they became the focus system of my upcoming research. They either gained shade diversity or in most cases lost shade diversity because many of these cacao systems are converted to full sun systems in order to create something like a short production peak. And it's not a very sustainable technique, but a commonly used technique to intensify cacao agroforestry systems because they are originally shade, so forest understory trees from the Amazon. They physically rely on shade, and so when you remove the shade, they also, you can only grow them under shade, but then when they are fully grown and they're productive and you remove the shade, then they kind of try to leave as much genome behind as they can, and so this creates a production peak. Yeah, and also most of the annual cultures have been converted into young agroforestry systems during this time. We continued this research by focusing on cacao. So in my PhD, I focused on cacao agroforestry systems and looked at ecosystem services, mainly predation services of birds and bats, and their interactions with the arthropod community in the area. And here in the small picture, you see how we did this. So we used exclosures to manipulate the access of birds and bats to the cacao trees in 15 different farms for 120 different trees. And by the end of the study, we even doubled the effort. And in the end, we had 240 trees. I will now present you the core results of my PhD, which was 120 trees that we maintained continuously through a period of 2 years. So during 2 years, we did bird and bat and combined bird and bat exclosures, and then measured effects on the arthropod community and on the cacao harvest. And that was a quite demanding question. Now this method is also applied internationally, but back then we were one of the first studies, and I think so far as I know, we were still the largest scale study, as at least with the manpower and how we did it, and also that we did it continuously for 2 years, and we did daily opening and closing of these cages that you see here, basically to simulate a scenario of primary habitat loss and also species loss, where we would lose these species, and we were interested to find out what happens with the productivity of these cacao systems and the arthropod community if we're losing bird and bat species in the area, and we did that with this field experiment. And since 2010, so from the beginning of my PhD study, which lasted the years that you see here are all only the starting years of this research. So in total, the research was conducted, and I was present in the area until 2014. So in total, my research period in Central Sulawesi was for 7 years, more or less straight. And yeah, in 2010, we started intense stakeholder cooperation and communication already at the beginning of my PhD. So we worked very closely with the local farmer community in these systems, and also work brochures together. So I'm sure you're curious to see some of the results. So on top, you see the results of the habitat gradient study. And on the left, you see species accumulation curves for the number of species that we observed on the different census sites. We had 16 sites. And interestingly, so you see in green the year 2001, the reference year in 2008, you see the results of my diploma thesis on the same spots. And interestingly, both in the observations and also in the estimated species richness, we found more or less the exact same species number. And that was interesting, especially back then, because species richness was often taken as a proxy of the state and also the development of different habitat and habitat types and ecosystems in the tropics. But when we looked at the functional diversity of the community, you see one example here where you see the relative change of abundance between the 2 years, and you see something like a 0 reference line, and left from that 0 reference, you see all the species that declined in abundance. And on the right side, you see all the species that increased. And on the left, we see a lot of forest species. And this was also really early in the time of functional diversity research, where we realized that we actually have to look at the functional community of the species, at their traits, such as habitat affiliation. We found the same for endemic species, so for being on the loser side. And that was one of the pioneer research from Southeast Asia, from the paleotropics, to show that looking at functional diversity, not only for birds, but across different species groups, is highly important. For the exclosure experiment, that's where you see the picture still on the top left, on the bottom left, we found that the absence of birds and bats had a tremendous impact on the productivity of cacao. So here you see on the x-axis the effects of day, night, and full exclosures. You also see the small icons above. So the left result represents the absence of birds and the presence of bats. The result in the middle is the other way around, with birds present, so night exclosure, bats excluded. And the right result is the total exclosure of birds and bats, the permanent exclosure with the cage that was always closed. And we compare this to an unmanipulated control that we had in every site, to be able to compare these exclosures to the business as usual. And so you see here confidence intervals, and they're not crossing the 0 line. And even if it doesn't look visually super impressive, I have added the percentage results here. And we see that the absence of birds and bats was leading to a cacao yield loss of an average by 30%. So 1/3 of the cacao yield was lost due to their absence. And this translates to tremendous economic values. So $730 for every single hectare and every single year of cacao production. $730 is supported by birds and bats. And translating this to the 1.5 million hectare of cacao produced in Indonesia, that's $1 billion ecosystem service. And we then compared this also internationally. I will not go into details here, but we found this across different tropical ecosystems. We found this for cacao, for coffee, for orchid systems like macadamia. and also forest systems. So, and other studies like the study of Daniel Karp, which was published in the same time, also found this for coffee berry borer, for example, in Costa Rican coffee systems. And today we continued these kind of research internationally. So it's continued in Indonesia, in Peru, in Central Africa, in Cameroon, and yeah, on the global scale. And then another key area I'm working in is, as I mentioned, stakeholder cooperation and communication. And parallel to my PhD, I studied journalism, and since then I always educated, trained. So I got a lot of trainings in science communication, but especially also stakeholder cooperation and communication, journalism. And I'm very happy about this booklet that we published. And on the bottom of this page, you can see the address of my website. There you can also find this booklet if you're interested in more details. It's for free download. And so we did not only publish our results in international scientific journals, but also in this richly illustrated booklet written together with and for farmers and practitioners in the local area. So it's bilingual. We wrote it in, so I wrote it in English and Indonesian, and then the language and the visual design and everything was revised by local farmers, local scientists. And so we all agreed on the content. It's some years ago, and we aim to do similar projects in our international tropical forest research, but also in the temperate areas we're working in. So after completing my PhD and this cacao farmer association work that I did in Indonesia, which actually lasted almost 2 years after my PhD, I moved back to Europe and back to my hometown, Vienna, and became a postdoc in a project of BOKU Vienna and University in Vienna. And this project was called REGRASS. And REGRASS is the acronym for Reestablishing Grasslands and Studying the arthropod services and arthropod community on these levels. And we just finished, last year, we just finished the last data recordings, and there are several publications coming up. So in the moment, there are several publications accepted. One should be out in a few weeks in Journal of Applied Ecology. And so it's quite exciting what we did. On the top, on the left, you see one of our grassland transects, and you actually see it's, so we were mimicking semi-natural and natural, low managed or non-managed meadows in the Austrian agricultural landscape. And they're quite narrow, as you can see here. So they are only 10 meter wide and only a couple of 100 meter long. So between I think around 180 or 200 meter long. And there we established these transects next to the most common land use type in this area, winter wheat. And we were interested how the introduction of a new agricultural management scheme or biodiversity management scheme in agricultural systems will affect different species communities across taxonomic groups. So below in the result, you see that we focused on carabid beetles, spiders, bees, and hoverflies, and looking at their functional responses. So the paper that's coming out soon in Journal of Applied Ecology is about the functional diversity of these groups. And just really short, you see, on the x-axis, you see the semi-natural habitat, the source habitat we're comparing to. Next to it, you see NG, so this is the new grassland. And then next to it, you see the nearby cereal fields. So there's a cereal field directly adjacent, directly bordering to this new grassland. And there's another cereal field, not in this picture, that was at least 80 meters apart. And then we were looking for 3 years how these species community, these wild species communities respond in space and time to this newly introduced biodiversity measure. And the main difference of this measure is, on the one hand, how easy it is to implement, because they're quite narrow. So it's quite, actually these are strips, as you can see on the picture. And the other and very important difference is that the seed diversity in this grassland mixture is much higher than the currently used seed diversity in agri-environment schemes. Yeah, and one of the main results, so you see the different responses here. So for example, spiders and carabids responding very differently. But one of the most important results regarding functional diversity here is that promoting biodiversity in agricultural systems takes time. So we see especially more mobile species like bees and hoverflies responding much faster to these schemes. But we also see that the turnover of the species is far from being completed or in a high amount after 3 years already. So we clearly see that the species are accepting this scheme for the dispersal and movement, but we also see that these kind of schemes would need more than 3 years in order to be effective. Yeah, so we did also a couple of field studies and experiments in this project. As mentioned, you for example, can follow my homepage or my Twitter account, and then you always will be updated on this. And yeah, when working in this temperate area with my background of working with farmers in Indonesia, we realized that the agri-environment schemes are not as much as implemented as they could be or as they are wished to be. And by agricultural decision makers in the European Union. And that inspired me to design an international survey of scientists and farmers, also due to my high interest and training background in designing social ecological studies and designing questionnaires and surveys. So the idea was basically, if there could be divergent views on the topic, so by basically common goals and common ground, but different perspectives on the topic. And if communication gaps could be the reason for the poor implementation, or one of the reasons for the poor implementation of the agri-environment schemes. So all this work together is also part of the consultings on cross-disciplinary work that I do internationally. So I advise different projects in Europe and in the tropics on how to implement cross-disciplinary approaches in their ecological research and communication. And the common goal also of our research is to contribute new knowledge to the sustainable land use transformations in place. I like this graph from the Food and Land Use Coalition that shows the complexity of sustainable land use transformation, which is closely linked to all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And according to the experts in these areas, all these common goals are also subject to diverse and sometimes conflicting interests, as I just mentioned. And reconciling these different interests requires integration of environmental, economic, and societal dimensions and perspectives. So coming back to the survey that I mentioned in the beginning, we were interested how divergent different expert views on the topic are on biodiversity and sustainable agriculture and the implementation of agri-environment schemes. And we did this transnational survey in Germany and in Austria. So the next 3 slides will be about the survey that we did. And the survey has 3 main pillars. So this slide will be about the questions that we asked on biodiversity. The next one will be about agri-environment schemes and conservation measures. And the third one will be about information sources and ways of information transfer and how differently this is perceived by experts of agricultural management and agriculture in Germany and Austria. So in this map, you see Germany and Austria, you see the number of participants we have from our two target groups, farmers in green and scientists in orange. And then you also see this legend here where we divide farmers in farmers with a completed school education and farmers with a completed education that's higher than school education, because we collected a lot of demographic data. And due to the very high sample that we have in this survey, so in total 306 participants, which also to our knowledge is the largest available survey, expert survey on biodiversity and sustainable management of agriculture to date, we were even able to build a statistical subgroup in our analysis and look at demographic effects such as education as well. We also found effects of age, which is highly correlated with education. So we didn't include age as well in the main paper, but we also find effects of gender and farming type. And here's one of here are the results for the first, the set of the first three questions. So the first three sets. And for example, we asked, how important do you think is biodiversity for agricultural production? And not only this general question, so the participants were asked, how important do you think is overall biodiversity for agricultural production, pollinators, natural enemies, pests, local plant diversity, landscape plant diversity. And you see the other two questions as well here. And I don't want to talk about all of the 44 questions that we asked here, but I particularly want to highlight the pattern that we found. So all the respondents responded using a Likert scale that you probably know from taking own service. So we had a 5-step scale, and step number 5 was representing a few that the participants found this factor to be very important. 4 was important, 3 was neutral. I cut off the levels where we didn't receive responses. So you only see the area of the survey where we actually received responses. So in this case, in the upper case, no one assessed one of these levels as less important or unimportant. And as an orientation guide, you always see this neutral level with the marked with a dashed line here. So the neutral level represents an opinion where the participants didn't have a tendency, so they didn't want to decide for a tendency, or they were unsure about the answer. The pattern is really interesting, that we see an almost idealistic view of scientists here, assessing most of these levels as very important or highly or important, and most of the farmers assessing those levels as less important than compared to the scientists. But we also see, especially here on the bottom, that so farmers with higher education than school education are situated somewhere in the middle between science and farmers with completed school education, which is quite interesting. And then we also assessed perspectives on different measures. So here you see the results on how effective do you think are agri-environment schemes, and the different measures. Here we're asking for the agri-environment schemes in general, but also for the implementation of fallows, vegetation strips, and so on. Or we were asking about the effectiveness of different conservation measures in the top, and in these two sets of questions, you see a similar pattern than before. And as I mentioned before, also other demographic parameters were relevant for all the results, for all the questions that we asked, and we found more biodiversity positive views in female farmers, and also wood farmers, so female compared to male farmers, or wood farmers applying organic farming compared to those who did dual farming or conventional farming. So dual farming would be a combination of conventional and organic. Yeah, and for also to present you percentage values, for example, for the AES, interesting, only 50% of the farmers found this to be important. So important or very important, but 87% of the scientists. And these are divergent views that point to a certain communication gap between science and practice. And we particularly see this when looking at the last set of questions on the different information sources. So the question on the top was about which information sources do you think are important for agricultural decision making? How important are these different information sources? And the second question was, how important do you think is information transfer? So which ways of information transfer are important for agricultural decision making? We see slightly different patterns, especially here on the top, and then familiar patterns on the bottom here. But what I want to highlight is the responses on science and scientific publications, where we see that scientists were quite convinced of the importance of scientific research or scientific publications for agricultural decision making, while farmers were not. And we can imagine the reasons for that. We know, we're as scientists, we are aware of the limited accessibility of scientific research, but this perspective is very important to take into account, as the whole survey is, in order to, so it's published in Biological Conservation. You can also find this on my website. And the whole surveys can be used as a tool for targeting, in our opinion, so to identify these biodiversity positive target groups that should be promoted more strongly in agricultural sustainable development. We already in the European Union have different promotion programs in place for female farmers, for young farmers. And this survey confirms that these investments are highly important in order to achieve the sustainable development goals in agriculture, because these are highly biodiversity positive groups. But it also shows us, and this may be as important, more critical target groups or potential communication gaps. So areas of worthwhile investment in areas of needed development in the collaboration between science and practice. I show this only really quickly just to give you another visual impression of the same survey so here you see the percentage results, and the pattern that I want to highlight here, so this is in German. Sorry, this is for a German newspaper who's going to publish it. On the top, you see the responses of farmers, and on the bottom, you see the responses of scientists. And in green, you see the more positive views. So when one of these 7 levels was considered as important, in the orange, reddish colors, you see less important. And the gray area represents these undecided, no tendency or unsure area. And 2 things I wanted to highlight here. On the one hand, you really see the divergency here and the different responses. And you also see, interestingly, that scientists seem to be pretty convinced of themselves and their methods. And also, when you compare the amount of gray area between farmers and scientists, you see that farmers were a bit more conscious, or like, I don't want to value this, but a bit more, yeah, more often undecided or with no tendency than the scientists. And yeah, as mentioned, this points to the need of more integrated communication and collaboration in order to achieve the sustainable development goals. This is also a question I asked in preparation of this talk on Twitter. So I was asking, what do you think? Which cross-disciplinary research concept is related to most benefits in biodiversity conservation? And yeah, I announced that this will be addressed in my talk, so it will be addressed in a minute. And quite interestingly, yeah, we found I also received the feedback that some of the participants said they are actually not quite sure of the definition of these different concepts. So what the difference between multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary is. We also see that almost 20% revealed that they are unsure with this question. I wanted to have the interactive poll at this point, but because it didn't work so well in the beginning, I hope you agree when I continue here, and when we still have time later on, we can also take the survey later on. But I wanted to show you this at this point. So we will postpone the survey to later on. I hope that's okay for you. And move to the short definition of this concept. And don't be shocked about this completely overloaded slide, but I wanted to provide you, I also will provide a PDF of this presentation, so I thought it may be useful for you to have this table, which also will be included in our upcoming paper in Basic and Applied Ecology, so please stay tuned for that. And so I have highlighted the most important parts in orange to keep this digestible. So the Sustainable Development Goal experts agree that we need more integrated approaches. And what does cross-disciplinary research mean? I find it important to introduce this first. And the difference to disciplinary research that answers specific research questions within specifically one research area, which also must take its claim and has its own value. Different concepts such as multidisciplinary, which will compare results to other disciplines, but without integrating them, or interdisciplinary, which will by definition create results that integrate different research disciplines, or something like the master level of this cross-disciplinary research, the transdisciplinary research that creates results that integrate academic and non-academic perspectives. And all these will be related to different benefits in the field. So we developed this table from definitions from Everly and colleagues published in 2010. And all these concepts together form cross-disciplinary research across different disciplines. And these are related to different benefits at the individual, the internal institutional level, and the external level that we also summarized for this paper. So in very short, individual level, increased motivation to contribute to the processes, being heard and seen, being realized and being integrated in the field. As I realized, for example, in my research in Indonesia, has positive effects on the data quality. For example, we decided to integrate only cacao farmers in our research, and that had tremendous positive effects on the data quality that we collected. And the mutual exchange, so not a one direction collaboration between scientists and farmers, but actually having this mutual exchange early on in a study, so before the beginning of a study, and not like it is very often done, like having a communication activity after the study is completed, is quite important. And these individual benefits will translate into benefits on the internal level for the universities, the NGOs. For example, it will broaden the possibilities to apply for funding, also on the external level. So there are many, many benefits that these cross-disciplinary approaches are related to. And integrating these different perspectives and different levels of biodiversity. So I was talking about functional diversity, community diversity, and also collaborator diversity and integration of different perspectives. We also know that gender equality and inclusion is central to the Sustainable Development Goals. And this topic was the focus of our recently published work. And we found by looking at the 13 leading journals in ecology between 1945 and 2019, So for 75 years in ecological publishing, we looked at the top authors. So those authors who published most papers in 13 different journals. And we found a striking underrepresentation of women and scientists from the global south or poorer countries or developing countries. We were also impressed by the media impact of this journal. So a week ago, when I compiled the slide, we had an altometric score of 557. I was curious and looked into this journal. The most cited and older articles in the journal have an average altometric score of 20. Some of them have an altometric score of 2 or 7. The highest score I found was 70. So you see with the score of 550 that this had a tremendous media impact. And this is not really surprising because diversity, equity, and inclusion is one of the most trending topics, also in science, but in general in public communication, social media, and in digital communication. So this was, from a publication point of view, maybe just in time, but we see that we are actually running really late with diversity, equity, and inclusion when we look at the global biodiversity crisis. And we see that many of the perspectives we need, especially perspectives from biodiversity hotspots in the world, are not represented in these lists. So you see in green are the countries where we found top publishing ecologists in 13 leading journals over 75 years. And we had 42 countries in the list only, I would say, because that means that more than 150 countries of the world are not in this list at all. And that's a bit shocking. And we also found that only 11% in the total list of top publishing authors, only 11% women. So this obviously needs to change because we cannot afford neglecting or excluding those key perspectives on global challenges such as the biodiversity and the climate crisis. Yeah, this is another way to show it again. So we found, most of the top authors in the US, UK, Australia, so the English-speaking wealthy countries in the world. And we found that this is quite comparable between the different journals. So here you see a list of the 13 different journals we looked at for the individual authors. And yeah, in green, you see the women, and these are all 100% bars. So you see an underrepresentation of women, tremendous, actually. And we also provided these 10 key recommendations for further actions. And this is also something I want to close with. I'm a bit late. So the take-home message of this presentation should be sustainable land use developments needs cross-disciplinary approaches in order to achieve the sustainable development goals. We also need diversity at all levels. And this will be awarded with loads of different benefits and promoting a development that we need to sustain human well-being and healthy ecosystems. So we also have these 10 key actions in this infograph. I think, so we need a lot of support and funding and guidance in order to achieve these goals. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions and many different perspectives.